The security guard at Croft Pictures barely glanced at my ID. Elias Thorne, CEO of Meridian. A name that now opened any door in this town. Any door except the one that mattered most. Until today. I walked the plush corridor, the silence punctuated only by the soft click of my shoes on marble. 20 years ago, Julian Croft threw me out of this very office. "You don't have the voice for this world," he'd sneered. Now I was back. In my hand, a heavy briefcase. Inside, a solid gold statue that was about to do all the talking for me. I pushed open his door without knocking. He looked up, startled. Perfect. Time had not been kind. The once sharp jawline had softened into jowls. The predatory gleam in his eyes now dulled by age and, I suspected, a few too many box office flops. Julian Croft was a relic, surrounded by ghosts of his own former glory. Posters of his 90s blockbusters lined the walls, monuments to an era when his voice was the only one that mattered. He recovered quickly, his face hardening into a familiar mask of arrogance. "Security is getting lazy," he rasped, reaching for his desk phone. "You have 10 seconds to tell me who you are before I have you thrown out." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just let the silence stretch, the same silence he once told me was a weakness. Now, it was a weapon. His hand hovered over the phone, uncertainty finally creeping into his eyes as a flicker of recognition fought its way through the fog of years. He knew the face, but couldn't place the power behind it. Slowly, deliberately, I walked to the antique mahogany mantelpiece above his unlit fireplace, my gaze fixed on the empty space right in the center. I returned to his desk and placed my briefcase upon it. Click, the latches sprang open. The sound of the latches was a gunshot in the silent room, echoing another sound from 20 years ago. The heavy oak door clicking shut behind a boy of 24. That boy was me. Same office, different lifetime. The mahogany was gleaming then, the awards on the mantelpiece were polished, and Julian Croft was a god, not a ghost. I'd just poured my soul onto his desk in the form of a 110-page script. It was my first. A story about a mute cartographer who mapped emotions instead of landscapes. It was everything I had. He hadn't even read past page 10. He'd tossed it aside, the pages scattering across his vast desk like fallen leaves. "Thorne, is it?" he'd said, leaning back in his throne-like chair, steepling his fingers. He studied me not like a person, but like a flawed piece of equipment. I just nodded. My throat was sandpaper. "Let me give you some free advice," he continued, his voice a low, condescending purr. "This town is built on noise, on loud voices, big promises, backslapping, and knife-twisting. It's a shark tank, and the sharks that eat are the ones that thrash the loudest." He gestured vaguely at my script. "This quiet little story, it's like you. It's got no teeth, no voice." He stood then, walking around the desk to circle me like a predator. I felt my spine turn to ice, my hands clenching into fists in my pockets. "I watched you pitch," he sneered, his face inches from mine. "You looked down, you spoke softly. You think anyone is going to hand millions of dollars to a man who can't even command a room. People like you, the quiet ones. You're meant to be in the audience, not on the stage. You're the background character in someone else's blockbuster life." He picked up my script from his desk and held it out. For a foolish, hopeful second, I thought he was giving it back. Instead, he dropped it directly into the wastebasket beside him. "You don't have the voice for this world, kid," he said, turning his back on me. "Get out of my office. And do yourself a favor, find a new world." I walked out of that office, the click of the door sealing my humiliation. But in that silence, a different voice was born. A cold, patient, and utterly relentless one. It didn't need to shout, it just needed to build. And as I stood on the pavement outside, blinking in the harsh LA sun, I made a promise to that voice. One day, I wouldn't just be in the room, I would so own it. And now, 20 years later, here I was. The memory, sharp as a shard of glass, faded. My eyes refocused on the man behind the desk. He was still staring, his mouth slightly agape, waiting for me to speak. He had no idea I'd said everything I needed to say to him 2 decades ago without making a sound. I lifted the statue from its velvet cradle. The gold was heavy, cold, and solid. It caught the afternoon light slanting through the blinds, casting a brilliant glare across Julian's desk, across his stunned, aging face. He squinted, his mind refusing to process the scene. The world's most famous statuette, sitting between us. "What is this?" he finally managed, his voice a dry rasp. "Some kind of pathetic joke? You barge in here with a cheap replica." "They don't give replicas for best original screenplay," I said. My voice was low even. The first words I'd spoken to him in 2 decades. The sound of it seemed to startle him more than the Oscar itself. Recognition finally dawned, a slow, horrifying sunrise in his eyes. "Thorne?" I nodded, enjoying the way the name crumbled on his lips. I pointed the base of the statue toward him so he could read the plaque. "The film was called Silent Compass," I explained, "based on an original script. You might remember its working title, The Mute Cartographer." The blood drained from his face. He remembered. Oh, he remembered. He remembered the wastebasket. That piece of sentimental trash," he stammered, shaking his head. "It's impossible." "You were right about one thing, Julian," I said, my voice never rising. "This town is built on noise, a constant, deafening roar. It makes it so easy for a quiet man to move unnoticed. While you were shouting at actors and taking loud meetings, I was listening." I began to walk the perimeter of his office, my hand trailing along the spines of leather-bound scripts on his bookshelf. "I listened when your studio took on a mountain of debt for that disastrous sci-fi epic. So I started a quiet little holding company and bought that debt. Every last cent of it. Then I listened when your top cinematographer complained you never took his notes. I offered him a project where his vision was the entire point. He won an Oscar for it last year." Julian stared, his jaw slack. He was a cornered animal, finally realizing the trap had been sprung long before he heard the snap. "I listened when your biggest star felt he was being typecast. I sent him a quiet script, a character piece, and bankrolled it myself. That movie outgrossed your last 3 films combined. You see, while you were busy being the loudest shark, you never noticed the tide was going out. I didn't have to fight you, Julian. I just had to wait for you to exhaust yourself, thrashing in the shallows." I stopped in front of his desk again. He looked smaller now, shrunken in his enormous leather chair. For 5 years, every major decision that has hobbled this studio, every project that has mysteriously fallen apart, every key player who has walked away, that was me. Not with a bang, but a whisper. A signed paper here, a quiet conversation there. The slow, methodical dismantling of an empire by a man you decided was a background character. I picked up the Oscar. He flinched as if I were about to strike him with it. "You told me to find a new world," I said, walking toward the mahogany mantelpiece. "So I did. I built one around you, and I made sure you were the only one who couldn't see the walls." I placed the Oscar squarely in the empty center of the mantelpiece. It looked perfect there, a silent, golden testament. "The board of directors held a vote this morning," I said, turning back to him. "Croft Pictures has been officially absorbed by its primary creditor. Your name is gone. The company, this building, everything in it. It all belongs to Meridian Pictures now." I let the silence hang in the air, heavy and absolute. It all belongs to me. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city outside. I had rehearsed this scene in my mind 1,000 times. There was supposed to be shouting. A desk slammed, the satisfying shatter of a titan's fury. I had built a coliseum for this final confrontation, and I was ready for the lion's roar. Instead, Julian Croft did something far more unnerving. He leaned back in his chair, the expensive leather groaning under his weight. A slow, tired exhale escaped his lips. Then he looked at me, and a strange, hollow smile touched his mouth. It wasn't a smile of warmth, or even irony. It was the detached curiosity of a man watching the final reel of his own film, already knowing the ending. "So that's how it ends," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. He didn't sound defeated, he sounded finished. He slowly pushed himself up from the chair, his movements stiff, aged. He walked not towards me but towards the small private bar in the corner of the room. You know, for years I wondered who it was. The ghost in my machine. The quiet little saboteur undoing everything. I never once thought of the boy with the script. He poured a single measure of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. He didn't offer me one. "You learned my lesson well," he continued, turning to face me, glass in hand. "Just not the one I was teaching. It was never about being the loudest shark. It was about being the one who never stopped swimming." He took a small sip. "You never stopped, did you, Thorne? While I was celebrating my victories, you were just swimming, silently, patiently." I said nothing. The victory I had craved, the emotional crescendo, was nowhere to be found. This quiet, almost academic post-mortem was a theft. It was robbing me of my rage by refusing to meet it with his own. He gestured with his glass towards the golden statue on his mantelpiece. All this. He swept his arm to encompass the office, the company, the legacy, for that. To prove a point to a man who won't even be here to see it tomorrow. He walked towards the mantel, stopping to look at the Oscar, then at me. His eyes, for the first time, held a sliver of something that wasn't exhaustion. It was pity. "Congratulations, Elias," he said, the name feeling alien in this room. "You own the room, but a quiet man in an empty room is just alone." He set his glass down on a side table and walked to a private door I hadn't noticed behind his desk. He opened it without looking back. "Lock up when you leave," he said, his voice flat. The door clicked shut, leaving me standing in the center of my new kingdom. The silence was absolute, and for the first time in 20 years it didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a cage. The click of the door was a period on a sentence I didn't want to end. Croft was gone. I stood in the cavernous office, surrounded by the spoils of a 20-year war, and felt nothing but the profound, ringing silence he had left behind. "A quiet man in an empty room is just alone." His words echoed, a ghost in my newly acquired machine. I walked to the mantelpiece. My Oscar gleamed under the track lighting, a cold and indifferent god. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. I'd pictured Croft's apoplectic rage, his sputtering denials, the glorious, satisfying crash of his ego. Instead, I got pity, a quiet abdication. He hadn't fought me. He'd simply handed me the keys and pointed out the emptiness of the kingdom. My hand traced the smooth, cool mahogany of his desk. Hoc stadi, home his desk, my desk. I ran my fingers over the worn leather of the blotter, the cold steel of the intercom. This was the nexus of power, the place from which he had pronounced my career dead. And now it was mine. But the victory felt academic, a solved equation with no real-world application. The silence wasn't a weapon anymore. It was just quiet. My gaze fell upon a silver-framed photograph on a credenza. It was a younger Julian, beaming, surrounded by a group of fresh-faced writers from some long-forgotten studio diversity initiative. Their faces were alight with hope, the same desperate, fragile hope I'd carried into this office 2 decades ago. I wondered what had happened to them. How many of their scripts had he tossed in the trash? How many of them had been told they didn't have the voice for this world? In that moment, the hollowness in my chest solidified into something else: purpose. This wasn't just about Julian Croft. It was about his entire philosophy. The brute force, loud-mouthed gatekeeping that choked the life out of 1,000 quiet stories before they could ever be told. My revenge wasn't complete just by taking his chair. It would be complete when I had dismantled everything it stood for. My finger pressed the button on the intercom. A tentative, female voice answered after a moment. "Mr. Croft?" "Mr. Croft has left the building," I said, my voice even. "This is Elias Thorne. Who is this?" A pause. "Margaret, sir. Mr. Croft's executive assistant." Her voice was laced with a terror I knew well. The sound of a career hanging by a thread. "Margaret," I said calmly. "Please assemble the board and all department heads in the main conference room. I want them there in 15 minutes. "Sir, some of them are off-site. It might take 15 minutes, I repeated, with no change in inflection. The silence that followed told me I had been understood. I released the button. The first move had been made. I walked into the conference room exactly 15 minutes later. 12 executives sat around a polished granite table long enough to land a small plane on. They were the Praetorian Guard of Croft's empire, a collection of nervous, whispering sharks who had suddenly found themselves in a new ocean. They fell silent as I entered. I walked to the head of the table, the seat Julian always occupied, and remained standing. I let them wait. I scanned their faces. Fear, defiance, opportunism. They were all wondering if they still had a job. They were expecting a speech about synergy, a corporate raider's victory lap, a litany of firings. I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then I let it stretch a little more. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice no louder than it had been with Margaret. "As of 90 minutes ago, Meridian Pictures completed its acquisition of this studio's controlling debt. For all legal and practical purposes, I am this company." I watched them exchange nervous glances. "There will be changes," I continued. "The first is this. Effective immediately, the name Croft Pictures is permanently retired. It no longer exists. Its film library will be absorbed into Meridian's catalog. Its legacy and the culture it fostered ends today." A wave of shock rippled through the room. I wasn't just buying the studio, I was erasing it. "Our first project under this new structure is already greenlit. Pre-production begins Monday." I saw a flicker of relief in some of their eyes. "Business as usual, perhaps. A new captain, but the same ship." I was about to correct them. "The film is a small-budget character study titled D-Type the Dust Librarian," Nuck, I said. I saw a few of them suppress a scoff. They were used to tentpoles and explosions, not quiet dramas. "It was written by a man named Arthur Vance." I paused, letting the name hang in the air. None of them recognized it. 25 years ago, I explained, Arthur Vance was one of the most promising young writers in this town. He had a 3-picture deal. Then he had a public disagreement with Julian Croft over a script note. Julian told him he'd never work again, and he never did. He was blacklisted, bankrupted, and broken. I found him last year working at a public library in Akron, Ohio. He hasn't written a word in 2 decades. But I read that old script, and it was brilliant. I looked each one of them in the eye. Meridian Pictures is not in the business of making noise. We are in the business of telling stories, especially the ones that have been silenced. Your new mandate is to find more Arthur Vances, find the quiet voices, find the scripts that were deemed too small, too sentimental, too lacking in teeth. That is the work. Everything else is just noise." I turned to leave. My hand was on the door when the head of marketing, a slick-looking man named Davies, finally found his voice. "Mr. Thorne," he stammered, "what about us? What is our role in all of this?" I looked back at the 12 anxious faces. They still didn't understand. "Your role," I said, "is to learn how to listen." I closed the door behind me, leaving them in a stunned silence of my own creation. Walking back down the corridor, past the posters of Julian's forgotten blockbusters, the office no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a stage. And I had just set the scene for a very different kind of show. The silence I left in the conference room was a vacuum, and nature, as they say, abhors it. Within an hour, the whispers started. By the end of the day, they had become a roar of panicked speculation that ricocheted through the building's glass and steel corridors. I heard it all without leaving my Julian's office. I just listened. Some pledged immediate, fawning loyalty. Others quietly updated their resumes. And a few, the ones who had truly thrived under Julian's reign, decided to fight. Davies, the head of marketing, was the first to charge the hill. He requested a meeting the next morning. He strode into my office with a practiced, confident swagger, a leather-bound portfolio tucked under his arm. He was the quintessential craftsman, expensive suit, loud watch, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He thought he understood the game. He saw my mandate to find quiet voices as a poetic mission statement, not a business model, a branding exercise. "Elias," he began, dropping the Mr. Thorne to signal he was an equal, a fellow shark. "Big moves, very bold. I love the new narrative." He laid his portfolio on my desk and opened it to a glossy concept poster, a chiseled jawline, an exploding planet, a tagline in fiery font, "Extinction is coming." "While the smaller projects are in development," he said carefully, "I wanted to present a transition strategy. Helios Gate, a proven IP, a bankable star is already interested. It's a guaranteed 4-quadrant hit. It'll reassure the markets and show them we're still in the blockbuster game." He looked at me, expecting praise for his strategic thinking, for translating my vision into something that actually made money. I didn't look at the poster, I looked at him. "Who is the main character, Davies?" I asked. He blinked. "Well, he's Commander Jax, a rogue soldier, classic archetype. The star is—" "I don't care who the star is," I said, my voice low. "I care who the character is. What does he want?" Davies faltered, the swagger deflating an inch. "He wants to stop the alien armada from destroying Earth." "Why?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse him. "Why? Because it's Earth. He's the hero. That's his job description, not his motivation," I said. "Why does Curry specifically care? What has he lost? What is he afraid of losing? What happens to his soul if he fails? Or, more importantly, what happens if he succeeds?" A slick sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He was a salesman who had just been asked to explain the chemical composition of his snake oil. He had no answers. He had taglines and tracking numbers, not stories. "It's just a fun, loud summer movie," he finally stammered. "Julian Croft made a career of fun, loud summer movies." I said, standing up. "His last 3 lost this studio a combined $200 million. The market isn't tired of blockbusters, Davies. It's tired of noise, of empty calories. You're trying to sell me a formula Julian perfected and then drove into the ground." I walked over to the credenza, where Margaret had left a single, dog-eared script that morning. I picked it up. "The Dust Librarian," by Arthur Vance. "This studio's next film has a budget of $5 million, I said. "The main character is a 70-year-old woman who believes the stories of every person who has ever checked out a book have been absorbed into the library's dust, and she is trying to learn the language of the dust before she dies." I held the script out. "Tell me how you would market that." He stared at the script as if it were a venomous snake. His entire skill set, explosions, taglines, star power, was useless here. He was a big game hunter, asked to describe the inner life of a moth. I wouldn't know where to begin," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Exactly," I said. I placed the script back down. "That's why you're being reassigned. Effective immediately, you will be heading a new legacy media division. Physical media. DVDs. You'll be overseeing the box art design for Meridian's back catalog." The blood drained from his face. It was a corporate execution, delivered not with a bang, but with the quiet finality of a closing file drawer. I was sending the loudest man in the building to its quietest, most obsolete corner. "You can't be serious," he breathed. "I don't make jokes," I said, turning back to my desk. Margaret, on the other hand, has been promoted. She is now the interim head of creative development. She has an impeccable eye for story, largely because for the last 15 years, she was the one who had to read every script Julian rejected before it went into the shredder. "Your marketing department will now report directly to her." He simply stood there, a statue of obsolete ambition. He had come in to manage my revolution, and had instead become its first quiet casualty. He didn't shout. He didn't protest. Davies simply walked out, a ghost in an expensive suit. He left a silence in his wake, but it was a different kind now. It wasn't empty, it was filled with potential. A blank page. The next day, I wasn't in my LA office. I was 3,000 miles away, stepping into the hushed quiet of the Akron Public Library. The air smelled of old paper and floor wax, a scent more honest than any Hollywood perfume. I found him in the history section, carefully reshelving a heavy tome. He was older than I'd pictured, a man hollowed out by time, his shoulders permanently stooped as if carrying the weight of a story he was never allowed to finish. "Arthur Vance?" I asked. My voice was a whisper here, not out of strategy but respect. He turned, his eyes watery and clouded with a weariness that went bone deep. "Can I help you?" "My name is Elias Thorne," I said. "I run a film studio." He gave a short, bitter laugh. It was a sound brittle enough to shatter. "Then you're in the wrong place. The fiction section is over there." He started to turn away, his dismissal absolute. He'd learned his lesson long ago. 25 years ago, I said, stopping him cold, you wrote a script, The Dust Librarian. He froze. He didn't look at me, but I saw his hand tremble on the spine of a book. Julian Croft told you it was sentimental garbage, I continued softly. He told you that you'd never work again. He was wrong. Slowly he turned back to face me. A flicker of something, not hope, but a painful memory of it stirred in his eyes. I placed a simple, leather-bound folder on the checkout counter between us. "I'm not Julian Croft. Meridian Pictures is making your film. Pre-production begins Monday. This is your contract." He stared at the folder, then at me, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. He reached out a shaking hand and traced the title embossed on the cover. He didn't need to read the contract. He just needed to see his words, his title, treated like something precious. For the first time in 20 years, Arthur Vance's voice wasn't silent because someone had taken it from him. It was silent because he had finally gotten it back. A single tear tracked a path through the dust of decades on his cheek. In that moment, watching a forgotten story find its voice, I felt a victory more profound than owning any building in Los Angeles. Julian was wrong. A quiet man in a room full of stories is never. Tell me about a time someone underestimated you because of your personality, and you gotta prove them spectacularly wrong. I want to hear all your stories in the comments.